Thanks very much, Jane. Delighted to be here. And I will hope that by the end of this evening, I will have clarified rather than added to the confusion about really what is the most incredible era of really all of our lifetimes, frankly. Now, I'm going to start off with about 15-20 minutes of remarks, and then I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm sure there will be many. That's usually the best part of this sort of thing. Well, we all know the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic have been enormous. As of the middle of June, more than 120,000 Americans have died. And if it were compared as a separate country, the New York area alone would rank by far as the #1 in the world for deaths per capita. Given that weeks typically elapse before death, thousands more who are already infected will likely die. That said, the direct daily toll from the infection has markedly declined throughout the country, including the epicenter of New York. The curves have been flattened. The stated goal of the isolation has essentially been accomplished for hospitalizations per day, for ICU bed occupancy, for deaths per day. And we also know this in advance of the next headline. Since millions of people at this point have the infection, more cases will occur with more socializing and relaxation of some of today's isolation. And more cases will be discovered with more testing. That is not a cause for fear or panic. It only reinforces the value of knowing the evidence and targeting policies toward the specific high-risk group. We now have an even greater urgency, specifically due to the severe and single-minded policies that were implemented. Treating COVID-19 at all costs severely restricted other medical care and instilled fear in the public, creating a massive health disaster in addition to severe economic harms that could frankly generate a world poverty crisis with almost incalculable consequences. In the US, half of known cancer patients were missing their chemotherapy. Almost half of neurosurgery patients refused to come in for treatment of diseases that, if left untreated, risk brain hemorrhage, paralysis, and death, even when their neurosurgeons directly reassured them. Transplants from living donors were down 85% from the same period last year. In the US alone, 150,000 new cancer cases arise every month. Those patients were not being seen. Missed biopsies of now undiscovered cancers number thousands per week. Half of urgent care patients stopped seeking medical attention. 2/3 of physical therapy was not being administered. That does not include the reports of missing emergency treatment for about 40% of new strokes and heart attacks, skipping 2/3 to 3/4 of cancer screening tests. And ironically, most childhood vaccinations were skipped, generating yet again a massive health disaster. Beyond the direct harms from shutting down the other medical care, directly by decree and indirectly by creating this overwhelming fear in the public, the lockdown generated a disastrous economic catastrophe. The policies have created the greatest global economic disruption in history, with trillions of dollars of lost economic input. These losses have been falsely portrayed as purely economic. To the contrary, using numerous NIH public access publications, CDC and Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and many actuarial tables, my colleagues and I calculated that these policies, economic policies, will cause devastating non-economic consequences that will total millions of accumulated years of life lost in the US. Indeed, far beyond what the virus directly has caused. The lost economic output in the US alone is estimated to be 5% of GDP, or $1.1 trillion for every month of the economic shutdown. This lost income results in lost lives directly, as the stresses of unemployment and providing basic needs increase the incidence of suicide, alcohol, drug abuse, and stress-induced illness. These are documented in the literature. These effects are particularly severe in the lower income groups. Indeed, 40% of those earning under $40,000 per year lost their jobs. And mortality rates are already much higher for lower income individuals. Based upon the expected remaining lifetimes of COVID-19 patients, and given that 40% of deaths were in nursing homes, the disease at the time of our article, was responsible for about 800,000 lost years of life in those first 2 months. Considering only the losses of life from missed healthcare and unemployment due to the lockdown itself, my colleagues and I conservatively estimated that the first 2 months of lockdown was responsible for at least 700,000 lost years of life each month, 1.5 million after the 2 months, already far surpassing the direct damage of COVID-19. We also know something very important that has repeatedly been understated. Total isolation prevents broad population immunity and prolongs the problem. We know from decades of medical science that infection causes individuals to generate an immune response, and the population later develops immunity. Indeed, that is the main purpose of giving widespread immunization. If you don't believe in that principle, you would never want a vaccine, because this is the principle of herd immunity, where we break the pathways, the connectivity pathways, from people who are infected to people who are at the high risk. In the COVID epicenter of New York, higher immunity is likely, although that too was undoubtedly muted by the extreme isolation. More than 20% of those in New York City tested positive for antibodies. A similar finding was reported in Boston, conforming to reports throughout the world that about 99% of people have mild illness, or the half of people who have no symptoms whatsoever. That fact, no symptoms in half the people, has been incorrectly portrayed as some sort of urgent problem requiring more isolation. On the contrary, infected people are the vehicle for establishing widespread immunity among lower risk groups by transmitting the virus to others in the lower risk groups, who then generate antibodies. Pathways toward the vulnerable are blocked, and that's how viruses are generally eradicated. While we do not know with certainty that antibodies from COVID-19 stop infection, it is expected. It would be shocking if it didn't, based on decades of virology science, including known other virology science from other coronaviruses, where immunity post-infection is known to last for a year or more. And indeed today, there have been no confirmed cases of reinfection in this virus. That's why scientists are hopeful about using COVID-19 antibodies to treat the sickest patients or prevent disease. That's the whole basis for the drive to generate a vaccine. Now, reassuring the public about re-entry, reopening, requires repeating the facts, what we know about the threat and who it targets. By now, studies all over the world, from Europe, Japan, and the US, all suggest the overall fatality rate is far lower than early estimates, perhaps below 0.1%, 10 to 40 times lower than the estimates that motivated the isolation policy. And we also know who to protect, because this disease, by the evidence, is not equally dangerous across the population. In Detroit's Oakland County, for instance, 75% of deaths were in those over 70. 91% were in people over 60, similar to what is noted in New York and all over the world. And younger, healthier people have virtually zero risk of death and virtually zero risk of serious disease. Under 1% of New York City's hospitalizations have been patients under 18. Less than 1% of deaths at any age are in the absence of underlying conditions. According to the CDC, 99.9% of deaths have been in people over 25, and 81% in people over 65. In fact, just 2 days ago, I was given new data. The most recent data just released indicates the fatality rate, if you're under 70, is 0.04%. That is less than or equal to seasonal influenza for everyone under 70. From the evidence, the deaths per day, the hospitalizations per day, the ICU uses per day, all have come down. Science-based logic to strategically end the lockdown and safely restore the pathway to normal life must now be implemented. First, we must protect the most vulnerable. That means nursing home patients. given that older people with underlying conditions are obvious setups for serious complications for respiratory infections. In fact, every medical student in the country would have known that on day one. That's not new knowledge. In fact, it really, because of that, it is difficult to excuse policies that allowed more than 40,000 nursing home residents to die in the US, almost 40% of all deaths, more than half of the total in some states, particularly when they already live in a controlled access setting. To me, it's inexplicable that states like New York shut down virtually all personal and business activities on March 20th, confining all healthy people with near zero risk of serious illness, yet waited 7 more weeks to introduce strict infection control with testing of those entering nursing homes. Urgently needed targeted protection means rigorously regulating all who enter and care for nursing home members by requiring testing to prove lack of contagiousness and protective masks and other equipment for those who interact with these highly vulnerable people. That includes all nursing home workers and staff to exclude infection and ensure safety. No COVID-19 positive patient should ever resume residence until definitively cleared by testing. We must also continue to educate and inform the public about what we have already learned regarding the high-risk group. That means issuing rational guidelines, advising the highest standards of hygiene, particularly when interacting with elderly friends and family members at risk, including particularly those with diabetes and obesity. Second, those with mild symptoms of the illness must strictly self-isolate for 2 weeks. It's not urgent to even test them. We should assume they have the infection. That means confinement at home, having the highest concern for sanitization, and they wear masks when others in their homes enter the same room. Third, all K through 12 schools should be open immediately, fully. If you're under 18 and in good health, you have virtually zero risk of serious illness from this virus. The recent JAMA Pediatrics publication stated flatly in a study of 46 pediatric hospitals in North America, quote, "Our data indicate that children are at far greater risk of critical illness from influenza than from COVID-19, unquote. If the COVID-19 hazard sets a new standard for health safety and shutting schools, the country will need to close all schools every year from November till April to guard against influenza." That would be their logic. Exceptions exist, as they do with virtually every clinically encountered infection, but that should not outweigh the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Every doctor knows every viral infection has rare instances of lethal or serious complication in an otherwise non-high-risk patient. That changes nothing about the data. The data on children's vulnerability goes even further vis-a-vis schools. As has been shown all over the world, Switzerland, Canada, the Netherlands, France, Iceland, the UK, Australia, Ireland, children rarely even transmit the disease to adults when they're infected, even to their own parents. Once again, we are disregarding the serious harms from the policy, in this case, the policy of closing schools. We never hear about this. Distance learning is absolutely not a substitute for the learning in schools with social engagement, physical activity, group learning, the whole dynamic of being in school. Moreover, learning by its own standard is in free fall. Boston has data that shows only half the students are even logging in on any given day. 20% of them have never logged on. The Virginia State School Superintendent was quoted as saying, "This situation is going to be like what is often called the summer slide in student achievement, but on steroids." And schools are where we discover, by the way, that children need glasses or hearing aids. And we already see something really heinous that no one, I don't think, has ever said except me. There has been a 35% increase in child abuse cases going to the hospital emergency rooms. You have to realize these are the most serious cases. A typical child abusing parent does not bring their kid into the ER. They don't do that unless they think they have killed them or broken several bones. That increase, 35% to the ER for the most serious child abuse cases, is something relevant to schools, because that's just the tip of the iceberg. We are missing most child abuse cases because the number one place where child abuse is noticed and reported is in schools. If you close the schools, you don't see that. What about teachers, people say, the risk to teachers? Well, half of K through 12 teachers are 41 years old or younger. It's a very young profession. 82% are under 55. But for those small group of teachers in a high-risk group, I would think by now they know how to use social distancing and protect themselves. But if that isn't enough, if they're still afraid, they can go home and teach from a distance. That is absolutely not a reason to lock out our children. Again, standards for consciously protecting elderly and other at-risk family members or friends, including teachers, should still be employed. And schools should and already have introduced in other countries that have opened new levels of hygiene and sanitization. But this is very important here. There is zero science and zero logic to recommend that children should be wearing masks in school, or stay separated by 6 feet, or avoid interactions in the playground. There is no data to support that. And those who do not open schools fully and without these bizarre guidelines are in denial of science, and simply by their actions, in my opinion, prove that they should never be in a position of authority in educating our children. Fourth, all businesses, including restaurants and offices, can be opened, but we can require new standards for hygiene, disinfection, sanitization via stringent regulations, more so than in the past. And it's appropriate to post warnings for customers who are older and other ways vulnerable. And in fact, we already see the private sector responding to this. We see businesses and workplaces setting up new environments because they understand it's obvious that no one will come to work or no one will show up to their business unless the fears have been reduced and it's a safe environment. There should not be, however, any requirements for spacing of customers. It defies logic that otherwise healthy adults, especially younger age groups, should be isolated or maintain 6-foot spacing. But here's the secret: 6-foot spacing is arbitrary. It's contrary, in fact, to the 3-foot spacing recommendations of the WHO itself. It's based on published papers that are embarrassingly weak, and that this week there have been increasing demands for retraction of almost all of the papers that supposedly validated a need for 6-foot spacing. If infection is still prevalent, socializing among low-risk groups, healthy enough to go to dinner out in a restaurant, represents the opportunity for developing widespread immunity and finally eradicating this whole thing. Fifth, public transportation, which is obviously the lifeblood of much of the workforce in big cities, should resume. In addition to new standards of cleanliness and hygiene that passengers would welcome, regional authorities could require masks for passengers. And I say that because given the state of our fearful public, it's likely most people will choose to wear them. Air travel should resume. Hygiene and disinfection standards have already been improved on airplanes, and further changes are likely regardless of any requirement because travelers will simply not have the confidence to fly without them. These standards at this point serve one main role, and this is a legitimate role of public policy, and that is to allay fear so people can function. 6, parks and beaches should be fully open. The closure policy was originally aiming to prevent all social mingling. The reality is there's no scientific reason to think that people should remain indoors. In fact, yet again, staying indoors is contrary to science, since the virus itself was documented to spread far more widely indoors in confined spaces. It's obvious even just from common sense. Given now that we know who to protect and how to protect them, even inside our own homes, all outdoor sports activities can resume with smart considered limits on large group gatherings to pay attention to how things are evolving. Finally, implement prioritized testing for 3 groups. There is no need for massive, widespread testing. That is a fallacy. There are 3 specific groups that need testing: nursing home workers and entrants, healthcare workers and first responders, and patients going into hospitals. Targeted testing for antibodies and infection is also useful to alleviate fear, but widespread testing for the whole population should never be and is not a legitimate predicate for reopening. And contact tracing, where you detect the virus or the infection, then you go on a hunt for everyone who's been in their sphere, is not very valuable once a pandemic has been established. That's not the appropriate tool. It's only useful at the very beginning of a new pandemic, because here the infection's already widespread. We have millions of people with this. Contact tracing could be useful for some sort of new second wave, or which by the way, there is no known second wave coming. That is just conjecture, pure conjecture. In fact, it didn't happen with some of the other viruses like this. In summary then, before I take questions, the total lockdown may have been justified at the start of the pandemic when little data was known, but continuing that pathway as long as we have is extraordinarily destructive by the facts. It's counter to the evidence at hand, and at this point is contrary to simple common sense and logic. Smart, safe reentry should not be ever delayed by fear or hypothetical projections. We have the direct data on the risk and extensive experience, both individually and as a nation, with managing it. The goal of the strict isolation has already been accomplished in the vast majority of the country. We know that relaxing total isolation will lead to more infections. Eliminating all cases was never and should never be the policy goal, but because it is irrational and unnecessary, given that we have a widespread infection that is not harmful to 99% of people who get it. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of cases in states with more relaxed policies are in younger, healthier people. That's well documented. The most detailed information, by the way, is in Florida. And these younger people are the very population that has no serious problem with the infection, and the very population that will serve as helpful in developing herd immunity. And by the way, in those states, there is no evidence of the disastrous projections that were made months ago when Georgia and Florida had some different policy in reopening. None of the states with earlier reopening are even in the top 15 states in deaths per million. The projections of disastrous consequences have not even been close. Let's finally stop focusing on changing hypothetical models that frankly have been grossly, embarrassingly, and repeatedly wrong. Instead, let's use the empirical data that we have, decades of established medical science, and basic common sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was very informative, as we knew it would be. So we're going to switch it over to Q&A now. And there are questions that were coming in while you were speaking. And of course, the floor is open if you were, for anyone else who'd like to post some. And it's almost amusing. If I look at the questions that already came in, I say, 50% are variations on a theme. It goes something like this. We're here in Santa Clara County. Santa Clara County has a really low rate. We see the data, you see the data. County officials see the data, state officials. What are they using to keep with these we think all very onerous rules? And Governor Newsom writing science in capital letters does not count. So what else is he relying on to keep this up in face of these good data points?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really puzzling situation, frankly. I'm involved with people in the area on trying to get at least a a clearer view of the micro details of the data, because there is no data of what's been published to continue this policy that's going on. It's really, honestly, one of the ways I answer is it's sort of impossible to understand someone who thinks irrationally. And I'm not saying that to be funny, but it's really, these are people like Governor Newsom, and I'm not being political because it's all across the country, many different states, are insisting that they want to follow the science, quote unquote, but there is no science to back up what they're doing. And so, what they've done is in my opinion, and I'm being actually nice to say that it's only fear, okay, because these are laymen, and I understand there's no medical perspective on the Governor Newsom himself or the other governors, most of them. The health officials are inexplicable in what they're recommending, and so I have to conclude that there is a fear that has infiltrated them and public policy decisions where they're in this mode of sort of stopping COVID-19 at all costs, as if that is the rational way to proceed here. And it's just not. There's a frank failure to even acknowledge what is widely known. So I don't have a good answer to what are they looking at, because they're not looking at facts. There is it. What's sad to me, and I live around Stanford. I look outside and I run outside every day, and even outside, healthy young people are driving in their cars alone, wearing a mask, or they're running on the track at Stanford that I run on, and they're sometimes running with a mask on. No one's around them. And this is not to make fun of that sort of thing. It's really an indication of the massive fear that has been instilled in the public by, to me, what is the biggest, most egregious failure of public policy that anyone has ever seen. And it's almost inexplicable. They're both fearful. I'm talking about the leaders that we have at the state level, and they are completely incompetent. I mean, I just don't know how else to say it.
No, that says it all. A related question that just occurred to me, and you spoke of the other very negative consequences of lockdowns, and we talked about elective surgeries, and the definition of elective, I think, was kind of odd in some of these cases, and child abuse. Is there anything about long-term fear that people, not the officials, but the public, of just living under this cloud of I could die tomorrow? Just anecdotally, I have a niece who's in her 20s, and she is super into self-isolation, not because of her, but she's staying away from her parents in the mid-60s, because it's almost like if I go see them, they'll die.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there is no question that there is a real serious impact on relationships between people. It's particularly sad because, when you're older, and even if you're high risk, I mean, are you going to want to have a life where you must be confined in your house and not see your grandchildren? I mean, this is ludicrous in a free country. It's almost unfathomable to understand that. But what I do worry about, there is a tremendous amount of fear. I'm most worried about instilling fear in children and younger people, because a lot of these states are forcing children to wear masks, and this is just unacceptable. I mean, we are creating a generation of neurotic, fearful children. And what's worse, the university is doing the same kind of thing, where there is virtually zero risk to people in the university population, with protecting the high-risk workers and things, but the students certainly have no risk. Yet they're going through all kinds of social distancing and all kinds of almost ritualistic policies that are really instilling fear and harming people long-term, and also teaching the opposite of what we want to teach our children, which is, I mean, the most important thing to me that you could teach someone, as someone who's been a professor for decades, is critical thinking. It's not about memorizing facts. They can learn that in a book or online, which is what they're forced to do. But critical thinking, and what we're showing them by virtue of our actions and the people who are in charge, is a lack of critical thinking. There's a very superficial analysis of the data. For instance, if I can go on, this issue that's in the news now that, oh my God, there's all these cases in Florida. Look what's going on. Or, there's increasing cases in Arizona, and we even see it in California, which is sort of a separate issue. But the main point is they're not going to the second level. Well, who's getting this illness? Because it's almost all people who are not going to get sick. And so what's the difference? In fact, there's a benefit, as I said the other night on TV, because of this herd immunity issue. But the knee-jerk reaction is, oh my God, there's a lot of cases coming up, we better lock down. There's a second point that's going on in California. People, I'm sure, are interested in the U.S.-Mexico border states. There's data coming out that shows that most of the new cases in these states that border Mexico are in the border towns because they're from people from Mexico. There's a crossover of the border going on. And so if you look where these cases are and who's getting these cases, it's not a cause for alarm. It's not a cause for lockdown. But this is how we're being treated and regulated, with this idea that the governor is talking about, you must wear masks outside. This is absurd. It's literally absurd.
Yeah, we all agree. Maybe getting away from the philosophical points, one of our viewers brought up a specific question that it bubbled up a few weeks ago, and then I think I read it in the lay press again today. A relationship between blood type and your risk for COVID. Any comments on that?
Yeah, there's a correlation that is not understood, that people with type O blood are less likely. I think that's the correlation. But, there's a lot of, so I don't know the answer. No one knows the answer. But I would caution a conclusion to be made from a simple correlation. Because there's actually a funny website if people are interested in bizarre correlations that have very high statistical significance. Mm-hmm. But there are things like the number of people who bought bow ties that year versus how many sunny days there were in Mexico, but they happen to be perfectly correlated. So there may be something to it, of course. I'm not laughing at the report, but I don't know the answer to what that cause could be. I don't know.
Yeah, that is just as interesting. Well, then maybe back to policy, because we're just overwhelmed by the questions about, we talked about our state officials and county officials aren't using the science. That's too bad. What? I know you're not, maybe you don't have a lot to say in this. What can we do? What can the close to 200 people listening to you right now, what can you do? Do you do the petitions? What can you do for our government?
Yes, I do think, and I don't think or maybe I haven't lost all of my being naive, but I do think that our political leaders listen to the people. It may take a very strong action, but their only incentive is to be reelected. That's their only incentive. So they need the votes, and that's how they act. And this is my own assessment of things. So I do think that it's worth being very aggressive and getting in touch with, for instance, the people that live in Santa Clara County. Constant contact to government offices, getting petitions signed. I think this only will end. And I've said this for more than a month now, by virtue of people saying, no, enough is enough. In fact, we are developing sort of already this speakeasy culture, I call it. And I got my hair cut the other day for the first time by my barber. And I'm not going to say where, but there's no windows, and I go in through the alley, and this is how it is. I know it's going on in New York and Manhattan. There are bars open like normal. I'm talking about completely normal, with shuttered windows. There's no distancing, no mask, nothing. There are restaurants that are doing that. So we have to push back. I think I wondered to myself, where are all these aggressive New Yorkers who use common sense and don't get pushed around? I understand there was a lot of death there, and I am empathetic for that. But we really have to start getting aggressive if you want to be reopening in a normal way. A lot of states are saying they're reopening, but I reject the idea of a new normal. I completely reject the idea that there's some sort of new normal.
I certainly agree, and that's good to hear. Do you have a sense for how this will impact young doctors 10 years from now? Will they be cynical? Will they walk away? Are they totally engaged? Maybe a few comments on that?
Yeah, that's a sort of an intriguing question. There's a lot of doctors. Doctors are not necessarily health policy savvy. Okay, so that's very different. I've seen a lot of doctors get on TV and just speak anecdotally. I held a child who died. Okay, but what I'm trying to say is doctors are just people, sort of, and doctors are generally, they're emotionally involved in this situation as individuals, and also there's tremendous amount of stress. I would say it's been disappointing, the reaction of, so I don't know the answer to your question. I think there was a heterogeneous group of people that become doctors for different reasons. But I would say I'm disappointed in the way the medical field has responded, because not that they're not working very hard, I don't mean that. I mean that they're not using critical thinking in talking about this. There's been a lot of very superficial, sloppy thinking. There has been a lot of publication in the best journals in the world: New England Journal, Lancet, Nature. These are journals that were so impeccable in their reputation, their level of requirement for pure, great, controlled research. And what we're seeing now is that these big journals are having to retract papers that are overtly fraudulent or just grossly inferior, because finally hundreds of doctors and medical scientists have written in demanding retraction, and they've admitted that they were false. A lot of papers are being published that are really just, I call it garbage. I mean, there's a lot of bad papers written about hydroxychloroquine. There's never been a study that's been good that shows that it's not useful for, the study's just simply not been done to show the main use of it that was hypothesized in the beginning, which is either prophylactic use or very early in the course of the disease. There's never been a study that showed it didn't work, because we've never had a good study done. And the danger of that, if I can just be long-winded here, is not only is it misinformation, but now there's so few cases, and there's so few people that are willing to go into a trial, because they've had this fear that this is some sort of dangerous drug. It's not a dangerous drug. We've used it for 70 years. It's a very safe drug. But they've been instilled with fear. They can't even get a legitimate study done now. There's not enough patients who are willing to be studied. That's the sad truth.
That's too bad. This next question has actually been floated over the last couple of months, when we had China-related type speakers on, and that deals with pharmaceuticals and medical equipment from China. Good, bad, how do we get out of it? How quickly?
Yes, well, so I wrote a paper on this in the Wall Street Journal about maybe a month or so ago, specifically about the pharmaceutical chain, because I think, as everybody has probably read who's on this call, a huge percentage of our drugs are imported, and 70% or 80% of what are called active pharmaceutical ingredients are imported from China and India, and India gets most of theirs from China. So we're very dependent for our generics and our antibiotics on foreign sources, as well as some other areas of medical equipment, particularly cheap medical equipment. But it's a complicated issue, because China, for instance, is super dependent on our prescription drugs, and particularly on our cancer drugs. And cancer in China is an epidemic. Their survival rates are disastrous. They're half of our survival rates from cancer, and they get virtually all of their cancer drugs from imported, including mainly the US, since we're the #1 developer of new drugs. So it's a complicated sort of bi-directional dependence. I have advised the government, and others are advising the government, on strategies to be less dependent on particularly adversaries, but also allies. I mean, our allies, everyone was scrambling for everything in this. And so it's important to be less dependent. It's important to be supportive of allies. And it's important to have redundancy in the supply chains. And this is sort of what's been lacking. When you have a drug that's still on patent, these are private companies that keep redundancies in the supply chain, multiple places where they get the drugs. When you have a generic, it's all about the cost. So they go for the cheapest possible production. And that's a problem. The second big problem with that is that our labeling is bad. We don't have enough information on the labeling. The FDA doesn't necessarily have a lot of information on every step of the production of every drug that we get. It has to be fixed. And then third, we've suggested more inspections of these foreign plants, because even if we don't relocate everything here because it's unrealistic, we want to at least have a better handle on what's being produced. And so with China's situation, by the way, they have alienated most of the world here. It's not just the US issue.
Yeah.
And so the ASEAN countries, like the Vietnams of the world, and Singapore, but also less developed places like Indonesia, these are countries that want our business. They are competing for our business, and they are low labor cost countries. So I feel that China is going to have a lot more competition for even low cost production.
Okay. So this next question is very interesting, and it deals with hypothetical. If there never was a shutdown, surely COVID was going to have an impact. Would it look different? Would it look the same? I certainly understand that early on, when you don't know, you have to dial it up to 11 and take every precaution you can. And most of this talk was talked about, okay, we don't have to be at 11 anymore, something much lower than that. Can you even guess what if it did just run its course? I think Sweden at first was going to try to suggest that, and then they got a lot of garbage.
Well, okay, so that's a great question, because as you say, that when the fatality rate is estimated to be 3.4%, which was the original one, that implies millions and millions of Americans die, and that we had to have a very quick lockdown, probably, at least if that was the data. The data was garbage in the beginning, though. It should have been known, and it was obvious. But in any event, Sweden didn't do nothing. Sweden didn't lock down, though. And so what Sweden did was they recommended social distancing. They limited groups to, say, less than, I forget if it was 30. They told people to use hygiene, to be careful. They specifically tried to recommend that for elderly people, although they grossly failed in protecting nursing homes there too. 70% of deaths in Stockholm were in nursing homes. It's really outrageous failure there. But in any event, I've read many articles and interviews with their chief health people, and they trusted their people. They said, well, okay, we're not going to create this edict, and we're going to trust you to do rational, sensible things according to guidelines. And they did have a significant decrease in their economic situation of maybe 20-30% GDP drop, but nothing like what the rest of the world did. And it is a false narrative to say that they did worse than the other countries. They did not do worse than the other countries with deaths per million. There are many countries in Western Europe that did worse. There are many countries that did better, but they're sort of on the level of what, not far from what we have. And that's pretty good. And that's because there are many factors that influence the number of mortality, the mortality figures, number of deaths. So if we wouldn't have locked down, if we would have done something far more targeted, I recommended that, okay? And in the beginning of this, I and some others too, recommended protecting the vulnerable, we know who they are, and recommending that they are confined. Anyone who's sick with any symptom must assume they have the disease and confine themselves for 2 weeks, and the rest of the people can go on with their lives. And that would not have changed probably the number of deaths. You have to remember something. They never really talk about this, but when people are talking about flattening the curves of deaths, where the curve goes up and then comes down, that does not change the number of deaths. In other words, mathematically, that does not change the area under the curve. All that does is change the shape of the curve. The reason to flatten the curve is only one, and that is to prevent hospitals from overcrowding. It's not to reduce deaths. So the gross failure, so the questioner is correct that there would not have been anywhere near the problem that we actually have now, because we would not have had the massive economic damage. And if we would have been smart from the beginning and protected those in nursing homes, where we already know, by the way, that that's what happens when somebody with the flu walks into a nursing home, is that it's like lighting a tinderbox on fire. People die in nursing homes and this has been written up many, many times, it's common knowledge. So we could have saved the same number of people or more by doing the targeted policy, probably much more, and we would not have had this. So, you know, I usually, when I'm interviewed, I don't spend too much time talking about what should have been done in the beginning, because there was no information. We had no facts. We didn't understand what was going on in China. No one knew. The New York area was being overwhelmed in a certain few hospitals. But the reality is nowhere else even came close. Okay, the statements were made, panic set in to our leaders. When Governor Cuomo said, everyone saw the tape when he said, we need 30,000 ventilators today. The total peak ventilator use in the whole state of New York is 5,700. Okay, they never came close to needing that. And that was just one of many statements. So we've had a lot of failures, but the biggest harms, frankly, were the policy, not the virus. And I think that's sort of the bottom line.
That's really sad. There was an interesting comment by one of our members. You spoke of the schools, go ahead, open them up. And this member is aware in Toronto, there was actually a guidance or a council that is addressing that and is in favor. In the United States, are you in your own island, Scott, or do you have any support? Or are there any people that are saying open the schools?
Yeah, so I want to comment first on the Toronto situation, because the Hospital for Sick Kids, which is one of the top 5 hospitals in pediatric medicine, came out with a big booklet, and they specifically said, just 3 days ago, I think, 2 or 3 days ago, I lose track of time these days, but they said exactly what I'm saying. Open all the schools, no masks, no spacing. And they have a very detailed document. It's super good reference. If anyone wants to look at it, they should go to their website. The answer to the question, am I the only one saying this? No, but it's unfortunately in most places falling on deaf ears. And it's again, it's inexplicable. I mean, the data is so overwhelming on this, on the schools issue. There is zero rational thought to keep the schools closed. I just heard Fairfax County, Virginia today said that they're going to have 2 days a week school in the fall, only 2 days, everything else online, and all the parents can say, well, we'll do online if we want. That's okay. I mean, in New York, you know, Mayor de Blasio not only has closed the schools, and the teachers unions and everyone's all in on closing the schools, they're also welding closed children's playgrounds in Manhattan. Honestly, it is inexplicable. There are people, I'm involved with many states who are suing their governors. I was just on the phone today with Michigan. There are states all over the country suing because there are rational people. There are even rational people beyond this Zoom call who have children who understand that this is just absurd and destructive. But again, it's really not, I'm very cynical that it's going to change without a massive showing of public support for opening the schools. And I don't want to accept, by the way, opening schools where children are wearing masks, where they're walking one way in the halls, where they're assigned a ball at recess and their names on it, and they cannot have anyone touch that. That's the LA County school recommendation right now. So I just think it's really a disaster, and we are creating a fear-based, neurotic generation of young kids.
I mean, I'm curious, what was the reaction to the Toronto position, both in Canada and the US? Or were people saying, what a goofball, or is there any traction?
I think there is traction. I think, again, like the US, amazingly, is the most extreme in the world that I can tell. I mean, I look at, you know, I do a lot of international traveling, and I'm familiar with these countries, and I talk to people in government as well as in medical science and all over the world, and in Europe and Latin America, in Asia. And our population is the most extreme for anti-opening. So in Toronto, for instance, yes, there is traction. Canada there is a lot of traction on this. This extreme posture about schools. I mean, the UK just said, okay, they're opening schools, and they're changing to 3-foot spacing, by the way, in the UK. Yet they're probably going to have some sort of mask requirement. It's hard to say. It's all about fear, really. It's not rational.
That's true. Okay, well, if I'm looking at, we've already established that a big bulk of the questions dealt with what the heck's wrong with our officials, and maybe there's another big bolus that is and we don't want to drive down the political rabbit hole, but what is the political? Is it, without being totally conspiratorial, why are there benefits from some people for the economy to dwindle and for despair to keep going? I'm sure
Yeah,
you've been
that's
asked that
certainly.
before.
Well, I have to imagine that if it wasn't an election year, it would be less politicized. I mean, there's no doubt that it's not just a coincidence that most of the Republican governors are for more reopening and the Democrat governors are for less reopening. It's not possible that that isn't political. I don't think, to some extent. I'm not blaming any side here. Because I need to maintain my political neutrality for my own credibility, because I'm talking about the data. But it is certainly I think it's very destructive that this is an election year. Let's put it that way. I don't know. I can't imagine any public official would want their citizenry to be so negatively impacted by this economic and social lockdown that they would do that for purely political reasons. I cannot believe that.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.